Welcome on Pascal Lamy. He is former Director General of the World Trade Organization and former EU Trade Commissioner. Welcome to the programme. You're giving a speech tonight about Brexit. I think you're also giving a speech about climate change and the current situation on Brexit. Now, you said this morning on the BBC on the Today programme that we made the wrong choice in negotiating withdrawal agreement first and then the rest. What did you mean?
Well, I'm trying to understand why both UK and the EU, a bit more UK than the EU, is in this mess. It is a mess, and my conclusion, my own interrogation, is that it was always to be a mess. But some thought it wouldn't be. Some thought Brexit would be a sort of short, surgical, deplug operation. That was not to be.
And that's you,
Brexit
Duncan,
has always been, and we should have understood that on both sides, by the way, better at the beginning, a long, painful, unscrambling process.
Right, well, that was you, wasn't it?
Well, actually, I agree with Mr. Lamy. I think the important point was the biggest mistake was made was right at the beginning when the EU and the UK agreed to put the withdrawal process first and separate that out from any kind of future relationship. I spent, a week and a half ago, I spent 2 hours with Mr. Barnier and his team talking about how you can unscramble this separately, and I made a proposal. The point is...
But did you think, first of all, did you think it was going to be simple, surgical and easy?
I never said it was going to be simple. I don't think it ever was going to be simple. But the key question was it could have been a lot easier. And I think the main point is that the two elements of those elements together, first of all, what dictates the way you leave and your future relationship are inextricably linked, because often the future relationship dictates what kind of process of departure you have. And therefore, whether there's issues around money, they're all dictated at the same time. But to separate them has been an unmitigated disaster because it's meant we never get to the future relationship.
All right, well,
we have no idea of it.
Let's remember that this very specific interpretation of Article 50 was not the EU interpretation. It was the British Prime Minister who was under formidable pressure from Brexiters who said, Brexit is Brexit. We have to do it now. We have to do it now. And in order to do it now, let's start the process, negotiate a withdrawal agreement, and then we will see. Now, the we will see is now taking revenge. The reason why the thing doesn't work politically in the UK, it's not an EU problem. Huh? I mean, in reality, there's never been a negotiation between EU and UK. The fundamental problem is whether UK can agree with UK on what Brexit is about, i.e., how much of regulatory divergence do the British people want?
Iain?
Do they want a big divergence? Do they want a small divergence? If it's a big divergence, you exit a lot politically and economically, and this has a big cost. If you exit a little, this is a little political, but at a much lower cost. And this trade-off between how much you exit politically and how much you exit economically is not available for the moment because it wasn't really searched. That was to be determined later.
All right.
The later is taking revenge.
Do you agree?
Well, I actually was one of those that said we should have settled where we were going to be as the #1 priority of what we want. And this is the point I just made earlier. Because we haven't sat down and agreed what the future relationship is going to be, which, by the way, dictates what those relationships are across the board, whether it's customs union or whatever, then it's been the wrong way round. Now, I have to say quite categorically, the problem isn't just I've never been able to agree here. The truth is Parliament...
But that is true, isn't it?
Well, Parliament itself is not in agreement, really, with the British public, because the Parliament is being elected mostly full of people, like Vince, who just don't want to leave anyway. And the reality has been, therefore, a process of blocking this. So, you know, with respect to Mr. Lamy, here, domestically, the public said they wanted to leave, and we should have delivered the leave by now on the 29th of March. By not doing that has been the disaster, I'm afraid.
I agree that the public decided they wanted to leave with absolutely no clue of what the implications of that would be economically.
And were they,
i.e.
was that the politicians'
an
fault?
inevitable
But with respect, they were
cost.
warned again and again, Monsieur Lamy, by the Chancellor, by everybody else, it'll be a disaster if you go, it'll be economic suicide, the jobs will be lost. They were told all of that. They still voted to leave.
Yeah, they
the
voted...
idea that somehow they had no idea what was going, they didn't believe that, and they voted to leave. So let's get on with it.
Look, I was the Chief of Staff of Jacques Delors in 1985, when we met with Margaret Thatcher, and I was there, and had a discussion with her whether moving the direction of the internal market was the right thing to do. And she said, yes, of course, because integrating markets, reducing obstacle to trade, removing border is a great thing for us all, which it was. Now, if she was right, and I think the Tories roughly believe she was right, unless I don't understand properly British politics, moving the other way around is at a cost. If moving the single market, if integrating these economies, if removing the borders was so beneficial, going the other way around has a cost.
Well, if it's so
how much of a cost depends on how much UK intends to deviate from EU regulation. And back to this problem, and I agree with you, that's the big issue, but there's no compromise today.
Yeah.
And the fact that we've left the future open allows a sort of paranoia on both sides. Brexiters believe they will be cheated, and Remainers believe they will be cheated. That's I think,
What
the
happens
political
next?
reality.
Well, I think it comes down to one element. All of these are the debate about what the future relationship should be. But the truth is, you could get this deal through if the EU and the UK were prepared to agree to the alternative arrangements on the Irish border, which allowed you to have no fixed border and the process. Now, these have been worked through, they've been proposed, but the government's never put them to them. I spent 2 hours with Yabana the other day talking to others. They all know that this is where it's going to have to be, because the existing backstop does not work in practice. It was plucked from Turkey, and it does not work.
All right.
So the reality is doing that will get this agreement through, and the rest is then down to about a year and a half's worth of serious negotiation about whether we want a trade deal, which I think is our best result.
With respect, I was the Director General of the World Trade Organization for 8 years of my life, which has something to do about custom procedures.
I agree, yeah.
And this notion that exiting the internal market implies no border on Ireland is pie in the sky. There's no way you can exit the internal market without a border. By the way,
that is not the
when did we have the internal market? When we removed the borders.
Yeah, but we didn't remember how to remove the border when we were outside of the Schengen Agreement. And the point it's also worth remembering is that the existing borders, you take something like Rotterdam, which does all the non-EU trade coming in, including SPS, food markets, etc. They inspect less than 2%, and they don't do it at the border. They do it well back from the fixed border. I'm sorry, I was over there. I went through it with them. The reality is technology now means the idea of barriers and borders is long gone.
I'm absolutely sorry.
I'll take you to Rotterdam
I'm
if you'd
sorry.
like to go and have a look
This is a total confusion.
Okay, have a look at Rotterdam.
And by the way, which also exists on the Labour side, between the internal market and the customs union. The customs union is about tariffs, goods.
Yes.
The internal market is about regulations.
I agree.
Now, if you want to diverge, which is what you want to do,
which will happen in the end,
I think not much of that will happen in my own view, but I may be wrong. If you want to diverge, you have to accept that there will be a border, because we, EU, have to control things which abide to different regulatory requirements.
Of course, but you'd work on the principle of two things. First is equivalence. The second, take, for example, the agreement that... Well, wait a minute. With respect, Mr. Lamy...
Equivalence is not a magic wand.
No, it's not. But here is an example. Take what New Zealand does with the EU. New Zealand is not a member of the EU. It's not a member of the single market. Its foodstuffs are not inspected here because why? They trust and agree that in New Zealand, the inspections that bring their standards right are at the same level or better than that of the EU, and they agree that that is done at the point of departure. They are not done at the border. So the idea of this being a border point is completely incorrect.
No. It's not completely incorrect. I'm sorry. I agree that if you want trade to flow as nicely as possible, many of customs procedures have to be moved upstream, but you still need a border to check that this is the case.
But the border is not. The point
Right.
is that our thing is not there. The border is a notional process that is about equivalence and agreement, not specific border checks.
But I mean,
No, we'd agree about that, I think.
No. What I will agree with is that equivalence is not a magic wand. You only accept equivalence if you trust and if your collective preferences are harmonized. I agree that, for instance, on beer, there's nothing that really says how you produce beer in the European Union. So there's beer in Belgium and in Bavaria and in Scotland. Yeah. And if beer is good for Scotland, it's good for Bavaria. Now, that is okay. Yeah. It's not going to be okay about GMO food or about chlorinated poultry. I'm sorry about that. We will not accept GMO food.
Fine.
If I don't know whether or not, but if you want to accept chlorinated poultry or GMO food, there will be a border and cost at the border.
By the way, the EU accepts chlorinated salad anyway, just out of interest.
Who will put it up, though, Pascal Lamy? Who will put up the border? Because the UK says they won't erect a border and doesn't want a hard border. The EU has pretty well said the same. The World Trade Organization won't be putting up a border, will it?
And so did Mr. Brexit, by the way.
The border is something you need to protect your consumer, your citizens, from risk of imports that do not fit with your regulatory purposes. Yeah. Take the example of environment, for instance. Yeah. We have a relatively hyper environment protection standards in the European Union. If the UK exits and wants to move down, there will be controls at the border that environmental goods or even services are fit.
But that is not done at the border. Anything like that is done at the point of departure and the point of arrival.
All right, while you're arguing,
you do it for others like New Zealand.
I'm going to bring Vince.
Look at what happens.
Can I just say, I mean, it is a very instructive conversation, actually. This is why I didn't interrupt. But, you know, Mr. Lamy is a public servant, right, who has headed the World Trade Organization for 8 years, actually understands trade law and trade procedure, which is why all this simplistic Brexit stuff is so completely abstract. But what Iain can't get away with is just trying to say, well, it's all the fault of Parliament and people like me. I've been completely open and honest about Liberal Democrats' opposition to Brexit from day one. We're not dissimulating in any way, whatever. But what Mr. Lamy has brought out with crystal clarity is that we're not dealing. You know, Brexit isn't a binary issue. You know, you're in or you're out. We've got a whole range of Brexit options. That is the single point. And that is why Parliament is paralysed, because the Brexiteers cannot agree amongst themselves what form of Brexit they want. And that's why we're having these elections. That's why we're in a complete bind.
All right, well, let's sort of move further, if you like, into the elections that are coming up, local and European elections. Is it trade that's talked about on the doorsteps with Brexit? Did you notice in all your discussions that you've had with local constituents that this argument that Iain Duncan Smith and Pascal Lamy are having, was that something that people knew about?
No.
Right.
Surprise.
We did two big kind of in-depth features at the weekend about particularly about local elections, and the first one was speaking to people in the parts of Greater Manchester where virtually nobody votes, up to kind of 82-83% of people. What was really noticeable, I think you can sometimes overstate how much local elections are a proxy for the national picture. This time, though, it was quite striking that people were talking about Brexit on the doorstep. They were, or certainly in Leave areas anyway, people are talking about Brexit. And when we asked people why they weren't voting, whereas in previous years they might have just said, oh, you know, there's no point, I don't like politicians. This time it was, I voted in 2016, nothing has happened, I'm not going to vote again. And we had a lot of people saying we're never going to vote again.
I think that you're absolutely right. I think the big issue is the distrust in politicians. It's that thing of, but I haven't seen anything happen. And the problem is locally, you have that issue of the pothole that wasn't dealt with, or that other problem that you've spotted and you've seen and it's still a problem. So you get that general distrust of, well, nothing happens at a council level, nothing's happening at a national level. Does anyone really listen to me, and does anyone really care what I think?
And I think austerity feeds into that as well, because councils have been underfunded now for the best, well, at least have had their budgets reduced over the course of nearly a decade. So councils are themselves less able to do the things that they used to be able to do. So, you know, say you vote for a councillor and the councillor gets in, they're probably less likely to be able to fix whatever the thing was that you were annoyed about in the first place than they would have been 10 years ago. And then that's compounded by what's going on in Westminster.
Do you think Brexit's going to happen, Pascal Lamy?
I mean, I've probably changed my mind 24 times since...
In the last hour?
Since the referendum took place. I mean,
and where are you today?
No, look, my heart is, of course, not with Brexit. But I have to work with my expertise and my guts. I think the likelihood of non-Brexit is low, but higher than it was a year ago. And a year ago, it was a bit higher than the day after the referendum. And I think the reason for that is that sort of the reality of the problem of unscrambling is slowly percolating, whereas a huge simplification, and I think Vince Cable was right, that the sort of either in or out, people are starting to realize it's more complex than that. Now, of course, it leads to a lot of absurdity. The fact that UK, who voted to leave in June 2016, is now having to vote to elect European parliamentarians a month from now, because this is the law. And it's the law that UK people, as long as UK have the right to vote. I mean, this is, frankly speaking, this is absurd. And this notion, that these people who will be legitimately elected members of the European Parliament will vote in a new commission and then exit just make absolutely... I mean,
well, Iain Duncan agrees with you on that.
Said,
he agrees with you on that point. And on that, I'm going to say...
that's absurd.